Today on Law Next, in the United States, we face a staggering crisis in access to justice, with over 90% of low-income Americans' civil legal needs estimated to be going unmet. But what if there's a way to dramatically expand legal help by empowering a new category of legal helpers? That's exactly what today's guest, Nikole Nelson, is working to achieve as CEO of Frontline Justice. After 25 years as a legal aid lawyer in Alaska, Nikole now leads this national nonprofit organization dedicated to establishing and supporting community justice workers, people who are not lawyers but who are trained to provide essential legal assistance to those who can't afford attorneys. Nikole was my guest on this show a year ago, shortly after the organization was founded and she was named CEO. She returns today to catch us up on what's happened since then across the country towards her ultimate goal of bringing justice workers to every U.S. state. I am Bob Ambrogi, and this is Law Next, the podcast that features the innovators and entrepreneurs who are driving what's next in law. Before we get to today's conversation, please take a moment to hear from the sponsors who so generously support this podcast. Tired of watching billable hours slip away? Bill for Time is the leader in legal time and billing software and puts time back in your control. Track time effortlessly with multiple timers, create professional invoices with customizable templates, and accelerate payments with built-in processing that gets you paid up to 70% faster. Take control of your practice today at billfortime.com. That's bill, the number 4, time.com. Now let's get to today's conversation. Nikole Nelson, welcome back to Law Next.
Thank you. It's so good to be here again.
Good to see you. You were on this show almost exactly a year ago, not too long after you had joined Frontline Justice as the CEO, and actually not all that long after the organization had launched initially. So we're going to do some catching up today and find out a little bit more about what you've been up to since last year. But before we do that, given that there are going to be a lot of people listening to this who didn't listen last year, that's their loss. But what are we going to? Nothing we can do about that. Why don't we just kind of start with having you kind of talk about what is Frontline Justice? What's the mission? What do you do?
Yeah, great. Well, I would love to talk about that. So Frontline Justice is a national nonprofit organization that is dedicated to empowering a new category of legal helper, the community justice worker across the nation. And these are folks that aren't lawyers and that are specifically meant to address the people's unmet legal needs of those who can't afford to pay for an attorney. And so that's the mission of Frontline Justice, and we're here to mobilize and equip and advocate for community justice workers to address our nation's access to justice crisis.
Yeah, how did it come about? How did it get formed in order to pursue this mission?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I came to this work, I guess, which I think is important to say, after spending 25 years as a legal aid lawyer in Alaska. I was the staff attorney and then went on to be a supervising attorney there and the longtime executive director of the legal aid program in Alaska. And during that time, we were trying to figure out, like every other legal aid organization, how we were going to meet community demand for services. And what I learned through those 25 years is that, demand for community services just far outstripped our ability to meet the need. And so we were trying to figure out as a community how we could do better. And we developed in Alaska a justice worker program that empowered people who weren't lawyers, who were trusted community members to help meet and solve people's everyday civil legal needs that they were really, having a hard time addressing and that were impacting their lives. So that's one thing that was happening in Alaska. During the same time, across the nation and in other communities, people were facing these same problems, right? And so our access to justice crisis isn't just something that was happening in Alaska. It impacts every community across our nation. And so likewise, other folks were trying to figure out how we were going to figure out a way to address that problem. And so people came together. There's an organization called the Office of American Possibilities. They think of themselves as a moonshot launch project. And so
essentially
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Probably just defunded this week, right?
Well, so they're, really a bipartisan organization. And so they're really looking for these big ideas to solve problems that are impacting people across our nation, and where there's a big idea that if it were implemented across our nation could have a huge impact and really turn the curve in a positive way for, nationally. And so the folks at the Office of American Possibilities really came together to gather the funds for Frontline Justice and to build the team to launch the project. And so I'm really excited about that. We are fortunate to be led by subject matter expert Becky Sandifer, who is the leading access to justice researcher in the nation. And so my work in Alaska was really informed by her research, which really helped me understand the size and the scope of the problem that we were dealing with. And I think that that's the case that, she has been really instrumental in helping us as a nation understand the size and the scope of the access to justice crisis and think of ways that we might solve it. So we brought this team together. We launched Frontline Justice, and we are, on a mission to try to make sure that everybody has access to right-sized legal help that they need.
Yeah. I know we talked about this a little bit last year, but I think from conversations I have with a lot of people working in the legal profession who maybe aren't super tuned into the A2J issue, they may be aware of the kind of the regulatory reforms that have happened in Arizona and Utah, and now Washington State is doing something similar, which allow for kind of alternative licensing schemes for different kinds of legal services providers. How is this different or the same? I mean, why focus on justice workers as a way of addressing the access to justice issue?
Yeah, so this is different than those efforts, although, those efforts are generally the ones that you were speaking about before, the regulatory reform efforts, in large part are aimed at, I would say, like market reform, right? So they're looking to figure out different ways of providing legal services for people who can pay for them. Justice workers and community justice workers are really targeting that segment of the population that's facing unmet legal needs, that can't afford to pay for the services that they're providing. They can't afford an attorney, or they aren't able to, pay for the services that they would be providing. And so we're really looking at, we think of it as justice reform versus market reform. And so I think there's that distinction. And I think if you are looking then at the problem from the problem as an access to justice crisis, where, the legal services corporation's most recent access to the Justice Gap report said that, 92% of low-income Americans' civil legal needs go unmet. So we're only meeting 8% of those. And so justice workers are really meant to target that specific population and address those unmet legal needs.
Yeah. So when we talked last year, you said that a goal of Frontline Justice and of yourself was to expand justice worker programs nationwide. How are you doing on that goal? What's happened since last year in terms of either expanding these programs or expanding even awareness of these programs?
So it has been going like wildfire. So over the course of the last year, and again, this changes, pretty regularly. I was going to say almost on the daily, but it's probably not on the daily. Right now, there are 8 states that have a regulatory environment that will allow for community justice workers to do work within those states. There's another couple
increase
pending
over last year. Are some of those new this year?
Yeah, they're absolutely new within the last year. So I believe at the time that you and I spoke last year, there were 5 places that had justice worker programs, or had a regulatory environment that would allow for justice workers to exist. Since that time, there have been expanded programs. Texas is on the verge of passing one. And there are working groups in 20 other states right now and growing that are considering justice worker authorizing regulatory reform in some way, shape, or form. California there's a legal aid-led proposal that's coming out in California. They're moving forward. Places like Virginia, Maryland, and DC are considering justice worker enabling reforms, as are places like Montana. So it's really a wide swath of our nation. There are working groups really considering how to implement justice worker reforms. And Arizona, who is one of the leaders in sort of out of the gate thinking about regulatory reform, has just approved another waiver within their state that models the Alaska program. And they have another one that's coming down the pike too.
And so has the Alaska program been a model, or have you kind of defined or developed or refined or developed kind of a model for what these programs should look like that you meaning Frontline Justice makes available to people who are thinking about this?
Yes, so the Alaska model, which is essentially one that is associated with legal aid or a nonprofit organization. The Alaska model is essentially the justice workers they are associated with the legal aid organization who acts as a guarantor of their work, right? So they provide malpractice insurance and supervise the services that the justice workers provide. So that's basically the Alaska model. One of the drawbacks to the Alaska waiver is that it's only for the legal aid organization, the LSC funded organization within Alaska. And so that cuts out a lot of people who have unmet legal needs and who are not going to qualify for LSC services. So
and they didn't get paid either, right? And they had to they were working for in some other agency or placement somewhere else, and they were supervised by LSC.
Yeah, so there's a variation on that. So some of the justice workers and the Alaska Legal Services, they work and are employed by Alaska Legal Services, okay. And then a number of those are in community-based organizations.
I see.
And so who are paying them? They're paid in their day job to do this work, but they aren't employees of the legal aid organization. However, the legal aid organization is providing malpractice insurance and overseeing the work of the justice workers. Moving forward, places like Texas and others who are thinking about they've expanded that scope. So it's not just the legal aid program. It could be other non-LSC funded legal aid organizations or other nonprofit organizations who also would be able to be the guarantors of the work of justice workers and provide that supervision and perhaps insurance. And so that's what we're sort of that's the variation. And I think we would think of that as basically the gold standard, because really, if you're thinking about the size and the scope of the problem, we want as many hands on deck as possible to be able to address this need. And we want it to meet people where they're already going to resolve going with their life problems and, really empower and upskill people who are trying to address people's they're going to for help anyway, and helping them understand how they might help address people's unmet legal needs too.
Yeah, I think one of the things you talked about last year, if I recall this right, was the idea that you want to have kind of low barriers to entry to get people into these programs so that you can maximize the numbers of people going into these programs.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because really, when you think about it, again, like what we think the numbers are of unmet legal need, it's like 150 to 250 million unmet legal needs per year. And if we really want to get to a point where everybody can have access to someone who can help them with those legal needs and enjoy the protections of the law, we really can't afford to have any restrictions that aren't related to assuring people are doing the job right. And so we really want to limit barriers to scale that aren't based in evidence that they are required to assure that somebody's doing a good job.
Yeah. I know that when I last saw you a couple of weeks ago in Phoenix at the Legal Services Corporation Innovations and Technology Conference, and kind of adjacent to that conference, Frontline Justice was having a meeting of some of the people who've been involved in your program. What was going on there? What were you doing in Phoenix? What was the purpose of that meeting?
Yeah, so we just launched a national community justice worker task force that's really meant to start the conversation and talk about what training it should be required and what credentialing might look like for community justice workers across the nation. So inevitably, like as I mentioned, there are like 20 plus states that are considering regulatory reforms that would enable justice workers to exist and do good work within their communities. And when either courts or legislatures are thinking about those implementing reforms, inevitably the question becomes like, how do we assure quality? How do we protect the public? How do we make sure that there's good quality? And again, as I mentioned before, we're really concerned about scalability as well. So we don't want any restrictions that aren't necessary and related to doing the job well. So this national task force has been stood up to have that conversation. And what's unique about it is we are trying to get outside of our legal silos. So 1/3 of the task force are sort of people in the justice space, access to justice space. It is led by, co-chaired by Justice Busby out of the Supreme Court of Texas, along with Cecilia Munoz, who was under the Obama administration a White House domestic policy chair.
Mm-hmm.
And
one of
we
the
have
co-founders of your organization, right?
yes, yes. And so we have 1/3 of the task force are sort of access to justice folks. And then we have another third of the task force, which are focused on low barrier adult education. And so they're thinking about how we train up the workforce of the future. And so we're partnering with low barrier adult education specialists, and Ascendium Education Solutions and the Education Design Lab are partners in this project. In addition to that, we have the other third of the task force is made up of sort of what we would think of these implementing organizations, sort of the community helpers that have a national footprint where we hope that justice workers might be embedded. So you could think of it as, sort of like the AARP. The AARP right now, they train, I think I learned 29,000 volunteers to be tax preparers across our nation. And so they've been training volunteers to do very sophisticated helpers, and they're trusted in doing that work. And so thinking about how we might learn from them about how we could train up a similar, army of legal helpers in other areas.
So the goal is going to be to develop kind of a standardized training program that states can adopt or not, I suppose. But is that really the goal, to kind of come up with a standardized program that you can offer?
The goal is a couple of things. We want to develop like standards and a framework for courts or legislatures when they're implementing these programs, so they know what the rules look like, what training should be required. And then also we will be developing some off-the-shelf training modules that we think jurisdictions will be able to pick up and roll out within their communities and adjust to their local jurisdictions. So it's twofold, right? So it's developing the framework or the standards for justice worker training as a whole, and then also some specific off-the-shelf models that would show a jurisdiction how they might implement and design those training programs on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. When you were on the show last year, you talked about one of the concerns you've heard from the legal aid community and probably the broader legal community is this idea of that you could be creating a two-tiered system where, people of means get legal help from a lawyer and people who are not of means get legal help from a justice worker or something like that. And you conveyed that there was some concern, if you heard concern about that and the implications of that. So would these standards that you're working to develop help kind of address or allay some of those concerns?
I hope that they do. I mean, I do think that having the conversation so far as the justice worker programs have been rolling out across the nation, I think it's important to note that there has been no evidence that they are producing substandard work, right? The evidence to date is showing that they are providing good quality service to people. So that's what the evidence shows. So people are not it's not substandard justice. It is good help, and it's better. I would say it's better justice because it's also coming from people who are trusted within their communities, and it's being delivered in a timely manner from someone that people trust. And again, there's been no evidence of consumer harm that people worry about. I do think having standards about this and thinking about the framework for training and credentialing will help people who are genuinely worried about that. It will give them some comfort to know that, there's something that they can rely on. They don't have to figure this out on their own, that they can rely on, sort of a national group of people who have come together from a wide range of perspectives and expertise to design something that is evidence-based. And of course, we want to make sure that people are getting good service. I spent, my entire life as a legal aid attorney trying to serve this population. My intent is to assure that justice workers are providing the best help possible.
Yeah. What are the types of matters in which they are providing help now?
Yeah, so there's a full range. There are justice workers who are able to provide help like in housing, landlord-tenant issues, appealing public benefits denials, like in SNAP benefits. There are justice workers who help with domestic violence, Indian Child Welfare Act cases, wills. We're really talking about just basic everyday legal matters that people on the margins face.
Yeah. So what was the kind of the end result of that meeting in Phoenix? Was it simply to kind of get this task force together and launched and send them out there to do their work, or was anything kind of decided or accomplished at the meeting?
Yeah, so the intent of the task force was to first get us all together in a room to start talking, and also to figure out who was missing. Who else do we need to bring into this conversation to make sure that we are not including just the same group of people or the same subject matter areas, who might have additional expertise that we could learn from as we're trying to roll this out. And so we did some great work around that. And then also we have a design advisory council, which is compiled from folks who are on the ground doing this work in the field. And so we wanted to bring them together too, so they could start designing some training programs that we can test out the national framework with, so that it's really been fed by experience in the field.
I'm speaking with Nikole Nelson, the CEO of Frontline Justice, about the organization's mission to establish community justice workers across the nation. She shared how this concept has been gaining momentum, with 8 states now having regulatory frameworks that allow for justice workers and 20 more actively exploring similar reforms. We've also heard about their establishment of a national task force to develop training and credentialing standards for justice workers. When we come back, we'll hear about Nikole's testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee and learn about new technological initiatives that Frontline Justice is developing with support from the Gates Foundation. But first, please take this opportunity to learn about the sponsors who so generously support this podcast. Transform your law practice from overwhelmed to streamline with Bill for Time, the most trusted name in legal time tracking and billing. Capture every billable moment with intuitive time tracking, automate your invoicing with custom templates, and process payments instantly to boost. Best of all, Bill for Time's award-winning support team ensures you're up and running quickly with live trainings. See the difference at billfortime.com. That's Bill, the number 4. time.com. Welcome back to Law Next, where I am speaking with Nikole Nelson, CEO of Frontline Justice. Before the break, we were discussing how the community justice worker movement has been expanding across the country, with multiple states now considering regulatory reforms to allow these programs. One significant development in raising awareness about this initiative is Nikole's recent appearance before the Senate Judiciary Committee, committee's first hearing on access to justice in 15 years. As we return, we'll hear about that experience and learn about some innovative tools being developed to support justice workers in their mission to help close America's justice gap. Well, let's get back to that conversation. We were talking before we started recording about the fact that you've been traveling a lot around the country this year in this role as CEO of Frontline Justice. One of the things you did was to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. What brought you there, and what were you talking about?
Yeah, that was a great experience. Yeah, so I had the honor and the privilege to testify at the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on our nation's access to justice crisis. That was the first hearing that they had on the issue in the last 15 years. And so really the hearing was about the state of the crisis and also looking towards what solutions might be available and how we might get on top of it. And so I was there to talk about justice workers as one of the game changers in that area and one of the areas that may actually, has the capacity to move the needle. In fact, you were at ITC, so I don't know if you remember that Ron Flagg mentioned, who's the president of LSC, that the two needle movers in this space, insofar as he can see them, are AI and community justice workers.
Yeah, I do remember that. He did mention that. So what kind of response did you get from the committee?
From the committee. So we got a great response from the committee. So there were lots of questions. People were very interested and supportive and wanted to know more about it and if there were ways in which they could be helpful. So I think it was a great response.
That's good. Are you expecting anything? I mean, were they working on anything specific in terms of legislation or something else that might somehow address A to J?
No, I think that it was a awareness raising, hearing. And so I had some follow-up questions from committee members, and I was happy to provide that information, mostly from senators wondering what was happening in their local jurisdictions. And again, UPL and the unauthorized practice of law and regulatory reform happens on a state by state basis. So I think we've got to take it up at the local level.
Yeah. Something else I think is developed since we last talked is, and maybe this was already in place, that you were able to get some money or some support from the Gates Foundation to develop some technology tools to support justice workers. Do I have that right? And tell us more about that.
Yes, we did. So we were very fortunate to receive an investment from the Gates Foundation, and we are looking with their support, to stand up a platform for community justice workers. So a space for the justice workers to learn from one another and to help support that community. And also we envision it as a place where they will be able to access training programs and other resources. And also what we think of as justice worker allies, which are organizations or those who might support justice workers and those who are interested in advancing the ball through regulatory reform in their own states, as a place for people to come together and have those conversations. So that's one thing. And then also we've been exploring how we might use AI to pair AI with justice workers to help advance and meet people's legal needs, particularly in areas around economic opportunity. And so one of the things that we've been exploring over the course of the last few months is a Snap AI bot. I don't know if you remember back to last year, but one of the areas where the Alaska justice workers were really successful was in drawing down SNAP benefits for folks who otherwise weren't getting them and had been inappropriately denied them, and so appealing those benefits. So our justice workers in Alaska were able to draw down millions of dollars in SNAP benefits that otherwise would not have been distributed as they were supposed to according to the law. So turns out, although Alaska's crisis was pretty extraordinary, it's not uncommon throughout the lower 48. And so that's an area where, I think justice workers will show promise. And so we had been working and researching whether or not a chatbot, a Snap chatbot would be helpful to help justice workers share information about what's happening on the local information with one another and get accurate information and the training and the support that they would need to provide quick and easy legal advice on Snap to community members, their neighbors that are trying to help.
So that's in development. That hasn't been created as of yet, or is it?
It has not been created as of yet, but it's showing promise. So that's one of the things we're exploring. And we think of that as just sort of
justice worker focused chatbot, not a consumer focused chatbot, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So we're looking about that. And that's sort of just like a proof of concept, because it could apply, although we're using it in sort of the Snap context, it could apply in a number of other, once you figure out how it might work in that context, then it could be applied in other areas, other public benefits denials or things like that.
Yeah. And then what I was reading described that you're also developing a research pool for justice workers, or is that part of the same thing?
Yeah, so that part of our strategy or our mission is to innovate and develop tools for justice workers to help support them. And so we want to be, we need for those things to make sense. They need to be deeply rooted in the justice worker community, and so they can be supportive of that. So we have a research pool that we hope to grow, where we can reach out to and you work with those who are on the ground and closest to the problems to help design the tools that would be most supportive and helpful for them. We also have another, something that we've started called a community cafe. So on a monthly basis, we have a virtual community cafe where justice workers and justice worker allies can come together and have discussions and learn from one another. It's hosted by Deanna Patton Parrish, and it's a really great time. So we enjoy that as well.
What else is new since last year? What else have you been doing?
Well, that feels like a lot.
That's not enough.
So we have also, so when you and I talked last, I was the only full-time employee of Frontline Justice. And since then, we've built up our team. So we have a chief operating officer, Alicia Mitchell-Mercer, who is wonderful. And so she's out of North Carolina, and she came to this work. She was a paralegal by training and was involved in the North Carolina Access to Justice Commission project there. So she's wonderful. We have Rachel Royal, who also is out of North Carolina as a program manager, and Celine Ta, who is our innovation team lead. So we got a full team, and I think are moving forward in sort of building out the infrastructure that we need to support justice workers across the nation. I will also say this is pretty exciting. Our National Leadership Council is up to 38 people and growing. And so it continues to expand. And we, includes people who are not just in the justice space, right? So we have added people who are doctors or come from community health backgrounds and other leaders in that area. And we're also really proud that it's bipartisan.
Who are they? What is their role in your organization? What is their role in your mission?
Yeah, the National Leadership Council, they're ambassadors for us. They're people who believe in our big idea and are there to help support us and help us share their expertise and help us move things forward.
Yeah. One of the things we talked about last year was kind of what challenges you saw to implementing this mission and carrying it out. And it sounds from talking to you right now that you're pretty optimistic about things, but what is your take on that? I mean, has your thinking about the challenges that you face changed or evolved at all over the last year? Are you more optimistic about your ability to kind of meet that goal of getting justice workers in every state eventually?
Well, okay, I'm always an optimist. And also, I think I am 100% going to meet that goal by getting justice workers authorized across the state. But I do have to say that, I think the size and the scope of the problem is so huge, and it has such a devastating impact on those who aren't getting the legal help that they need, that we don't have any time to waste. And so I feel like we've made amazing progress over the course of the last year, but it's not moving fast enough. And so, people are losing their houses. Children are going without food. Their families are being separated. There are huge and devastating consequences of not getting legal help that people need. And so we just don't have any time to waste. And so, I would like us to get moving much faster than we are. I think that's probably the same thing I said last year, but it is, I think, the biggest challenge, because I think that the inability to access legal help and to have protection of the law for the majority of the people across this nation, everyday nation, it undermines our democracy. And it's, I think we don't have time to waste.
Yeah. Again, not to rehash everything we talked about last year, but the whole question of the regulatory structure does keep coming up. Earlier in today's interview, you referred to states that have kind of the regulatory structure that would allow justice worker programs to exist. As I recall last year, you also made the point that it's not necessarily the case that you need to change the regulatory structure for there to be justice worker programs. So, kind of what is your thinking right now in terms of what needs to happen or doesn't need to happen in terms of re-regulation of legal practice for justice workers to be able to develop and thrive in this country?
Yeah, so the unauthorized practice of law prohibitions across our nation are very uneven. And so in most places, some type of regulatory reform is going to be needed for justice workers to be able to address people's unmet legal needs on most of the everyday problems that they are facing. That's without question. That said, justice workers, although they're not called as such, people who aren't lawyers have been able to provide legal assistance in some form or fashion across the nation in particular areas of practice. So it's twofold, right? So there are examples where justice workers have existed in the immigration space. They may not have been called justice workers, but people who aren't lawyers, they're accredited representatives, and they have been doing this work very well for a very long time. They're tribal lay advocates, and there are a number of other areas in administrative practices, particularly where people who aren't lawyers have been providing effective legal help for quite some time. That said, I think there are absolutely the prohibitions on the unauthorized practice of law in most states prohibit people from being able to give just simple legal assistance when they clearly can. And those are in areas that are in sort of state court, like family law matters, guardianship, those areas, eviction prevention, debt relief, those kinds of things. In most areas, you're going to need to have some type of carve-out, UPL carve-out, in order to authorize justice workers to be able to help in those areas. And it seems to me that that's a place where they would be very effective, and there's a huge unmet need. And so you're really going to need to, we'll need regulatory reforms to make that happen.
Yeah. The other thing we talked about is just this issue of kind of cultural resistance within the legal profession in particular. Mm-hmm. I know it's only been a year, but do you think we're making any progress on that point?
I actually think we are. I think the fact that we've got 20 plus states in play that are that have working groups considering this shows that there's been a huge shift in the way of thinking, right? That we really need to be laser focused. If we as a profession believe that access to justice is one of our responsibilities, and I think that we do, that really when you look at the size and the scope of the problem, we need to be laser focused on fixing that. And, there's enough injustice to go around. We should let other people in on it if they can be effective helpers. And so I think that shift is taking hold.
If we make this an annual thing, and I invite you back next year to talk about updates, what are you going to be telling me about in a year?
Okay, that's great. Well, I hope to come back next year. I want to be your annual January guest. Okay. What will I be telling you about next year? I hope that by next year, I can report back on the work of the task force and how successful the off-the-shelf training modules have been and where we're rolling those out. I hope that maybe we'll have 20 more states in play, and that those that are in working groups now will have already been implemented. And so I would love it if we could report back on that. And then I also hope that I think the evidence base of how well justice workers are serving their neighbors and serving their communities will have expanded, and we'll have more evidence to, again, show that not only has there been no consumer harm, but there's been great good that's come of the good work that's being done.
Of the states that are in play right now, are some of them close? I mean, are we on the cusp of seeing this happen in other states right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So Texas right now is, so Texas, it has a rule it's a Supreme Court rule that is in the public comment period. So it's pretty close. We're waiting on that. Again, California, there's a new proposal it's legal aid developed and led. But it has support of the Bar Association. And so, we're hopeful with respect to that. Virginia's got a working group. DC does, Maryland does. So I think there's all sorts of, I don't know how quickly they will move, but I could see, progress and more states jumping over in the next few months.
Yeah. Anything else that we haven't talked about that you want to talk about today?
I don't think so. I think I've covered it all.
Good. Well, no, it's, I think it's really important work that you're doing, and it hopefully more states will get on board with this quickly. And I think it can really make an impact on the justice crisis in this country. So commendations to you and your organization for the work that you're doing here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.
Appreciate
Thanks.
it.
Good to see you. We'll check back next year.
Okay, great.
All
Thank
right.
you.
See ya. Safe travels. Bye. Thanks for listening to today's show. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to share your own thoughts or comments, please do so by messaging us on LinkedIn or other social media, or just email me directly, ambrogi@gmail.com. If you're a fan of the show, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. LawNext is a production of LawNext Media. I'm your host, Bob Ambrogi. I hope you'll join us again next time for another episode of Law Next.